4 weeks, 1 question. Have you ever wondered why you have studied English for years, watched countless videos, filled notebooks with notes, yet when it's time to speak, your throat feels locked? It's not because you are lazy. It's not because you are bad at languages. Sometimes, it's because you are carrying too much pressure, too much fear of mistakes, and not enough permission to say one simple word, sorry. I realized this during the last 4 weeks of my life in the United States, all starting from one quiet question. Why do Americans apologize so often? And an even deeper one, can saying sorry actually show strength? In my first week in the US, I had no big plan. I just wanted to slow down, observe life, and continue learning English in my own way. But from the moment I stepped out of the airport, I started hearing the word sorry everywhere. Someone brushed past me and said sorry. Someone blocked the aisle and said sorry. Even when I bumped into someone else, they still said sorry. I stopped for a second. In my mind, a very familiar thought appeared. Why are they apologizing? It wasn't their fault. As the days passed, sorry became like background music to daily life. Soft. Fast. No drama. No long explanations. Just sorry, and then people moved on. Slowly, I stopped comparing English vocabulary and started comparing emotions. Back home, saying sorry often feels heavy. It feels like losing face, admitting weakness, or losing an argument. Here, saying sorry feels like opening a window and letting fresh air in. No winners. No losers. Just peace. During those days, my English didn't magically improve overnight. I still listened slowly. I still spoke slowly. I still forgot simple words. But something inside me changed. I allowed myself to make mistakes. I allowed myself to speak broken English. I allowed myself to stop in the middle of a sentence and say, sorry. Let me try again. And something surprising happened. No one looked annoyed. No one rushed me. They waited. They listened. And I could breathe. One morning, in a small coffee shop, I accidentally spilled some water on the table. My old reaction kicked in immediately, panic, embarrassment, self-blame. But before I could say much, the barista smiled and said, "It's okay. Sorry about that." I froze for a moment. I was the one who spilled the water. Yet he apologized to me. Not because it was his fault, but because he cared about how I might feel. That was the moment I understood something important. In America, sorry is not about guilt. It's about connection. 4 weeks may sound short, but they were long enough for me to understand why learning English used to feel so heavy. I wasn't just learning a language. I was fighting my fear of being wrong. I was trying to sound perfect in a language that isn't mine. And that kind of pressure is exhausting. In the US, I noticed that people often apologize before conflict even begins. It's like a quiet message. I value peace more than my ego. This experience changed the way I practice English. I stopped punishing myself for mistakes. If I didn't understand a listening clip, sorry, I replayed it. If I mispronounced a word, sorry, I corrected it. If I felt awkward in a conversation, sorry, I continued. No drama. No self-judgment. Just progress. For the first time in a long while, practicing listening, reading, and speaking English felt light instead of painful. Maybe if you are watching this video right now, you are also thinking about giving up. Maybe you feel tired, slow, or disappointed with yourself. But what if the problem isn't your ability? What if it's the way you talk to yourself when you make mistakes? Americans don't apologize often because they are weak. They apologize because they understand something simple. Protecting human connection is more important than proving you are right. And here's the quiet lesson I learned in these 4 weeks. English is not just grammar. It's not just vocabulary. It's a way of relating to people. When you learn how to say sorry without shame, you also learn how to keep conversations alive, relationships healthy, and your motivation strong. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do, in language learning, in marriage, and in life, is to lower your ego and say 2 small words with honesty. I'm sorry. Week 1 culture hits hard. Week 1 in America didn't feel like a movie scene. There was no dramatic background music, no inspiring voice in my head. It felt quiet, slightly cold, and strangely heavy. The kind of heavy that sits on your chest when everything around you looks normal, but inside, you feel out of place. That was my first real culture shock, not the buildings, not the technology, but the feeling that I didn't quite belong yet. The weather was the first reminder. The air felt different. Drier. Sharper. Mornings were cold, afternoons suddenly warm. Back home, I was used to predictable heat, familiar humidity. Here, my body had to adjust, just like my mind. And every small discomfort made my English feel worse. When you're tired, cold, or unsure, your brain doesn't want to speak another language. It wants safety. Silence feels safer than sounding wrong. On my second day, I went to a grocery store alone. A simple task, right? But I stood in front of a shelf for almost a minute, reading labels slowly, translating in my head, worrying about pronunciation. When I finally asked an employee a question, my sentence came out. Broken. Very broken. I paused, embarrassed, and said softly, sorry, my English is not good. She smiled immediately and replied, that's okay. Take your time. Her tone was calm. No pressure. No judgment. And then she added, sorry, I talk fast sometimes. That sentence stayed with me longer than she probably realized. I walked away thinking about it. I apologized because I felt weak. She apologized because she wanted me to feel comfortable. Same word. Very different meaning. That contrast followed me throughout the entire first week. Culture shock doesn't always hit like a wave. Sometimes it drips slowly. In conversations, I noticed Americans apologizing before problems even existed. Sorry to bother you. Sorry, quick question. Sorry, just checking. At first, I thought they were overly polite. Then I realized something deeper. These small apologies were not about fault. They were about respect for personal space, time, and emotions. Back home, silence often means politeness. You don't speak unless you're sure. In America, speaking gently is how you show respect. And sorry is like a soft landing pad for conversation. It tells the other person, I'm aware of you. That realization hit me hard, because for years, my English learning strategy had been the opposite. I waited until I felt ready. I waited until sentences were perfect. And most of the time, I waited so long that the moment passed. Midweek, I had a small misunderstanding at a cafe. The order was wrong. Not a big deal. But I hesitated. Should I say something? My mind raced. Wrong words, wrong tone, wrong grammar. Before I could decide, the cashier noticed my hesitation and said, sorry about that. Let me fix it. Again, he apologized first. I hadn't even complained. And just like that, the tension disappeared. No conflict ever formed. That moment taught me something important about communication psychology. When people apologize early, the brain relaxes. Studies in social psychology show that a simple apology can reduce defensive reactions and lower stress levels almost immediately. You don't need long explanations. The word itself signals safety. And safety is exactly what language learners need most. By the end of week 1, I noticed a pattern in myself. The more relaxed the situation, the easier English felt. Not faster. Not more fluent. Just lighter. My sentences were still simple. My listening still required focus. But I wasn't fighting myself anymore. I wasn't mentally punishing every mistake. When I didn't understand, I said, sorry, could you repeat that? And people did. Kindly. Patiently. At night, I thought about my marriage, too. How many arguments back home started because neither of us wanted to say sorry first? How many times did silence feel like strength, when it was actually fear? In American culture, I saw couples apologize casually. Not dramatically. Just small repairs. Throughout the day. Like emotional maintenance. It made me wonder how different things could be if sorry wasn't saved only for big mistakes. Week 1 didn't make me fluent. It didn't fix everything. But it cracked something open. I began to see that learning English in America wasn't just about immersion. It was about adopting a different emotional posture. Less defense. Less pride. More willingness to sound human. If you're learning English and feel tired, maybe it's not the language exhausting you. Maybe it's the constant pressure to be right. American culture taught me this. Quietly in my first week, confidence doesn't come from perfection. It comes from knowing you can recover. And recovery often starts with one small word. Here's the punchline that stayed with me at the end of week 1, when you're not afraid to say sorry, you stop being afraid to speak. And when fear leaves, learning finally has space to breathe. Sorry in everyday America. By the start of the second week, something subtle had shifted inside me. I was still new. Still foreign. Still thinking in one language and speaking in another. But I was no longer surprised every time I heard the word sorry. Instead, I started listening more carefully to how Americans used it. Not the sound of the word, but the intention behind it. And that's when everyday life itself became my English teacher. One morning, I was waiting at a crosswalk. The light was red. Cars stopped. A man stepped slightly into my personal space while checking his phone. Immediately, without even looking up, he said, "Oh, sorry." No eye contact. No explanation. Just acknowledgement. I nodded instinctively. And we both returned to our silence. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, yet it felt complete. No awkwardness. No tension. The word did its job and quietly disappeared. I started noticing this pattern everywhere. In elevators. In hallways. On sidewalks. Sorry wasn't emotional. It wasn't heavy. It was functional. Like oil in a machine. It reduced friction, so life could keep moving smoothly. Back home, we often wait until friction becomes heat before addressing it. Here, Americans cool things down before they even warm up. This realization changed the way I observed conversations. When someone said, "Sorry to interrupt," they weren't really apologizing for interrupting. They were asking for permission to exist in that moment. When someone said, "Sorry, quick question," they were signaling respect for your time. The word wasn't about blame. It was about boundaries. And that distinction mattered more than I expected. As an English learner, this hit close to home. For years, I thought my biggest problem was vocabulary. Then grammar. Then pronunciation. But watching everyday American interactions made me realize something uncomfortable. My real struggle was emotional timing. I waited too long to speak. I waited until I felt completely sure. Americans didn't. They stepped in gently, softened the moment with a sorry, and trusted the conversation to adjust. One afternoon at a public library, I was struggling with the printer. Papers stuck. Screen frozen. I stood there, silently panicking, afraid to ask for help. A woman walked by, noticed my confusion, and said, "Sorry, do you need help?" She apologized for offering help. That moment felt strange and warm at the same time. In my culture, helping doesn't require an apology. In American culture, it often begins with one. Not because help is wrong, but because autonomy is respected. I thought about my own English learning journey. How many times did I stay quiet in class? How many conversations ended before they began? Because I didn't want to interrupt, bother, or sound stupid. In America, sorry acts like a soft doorbell. You ring it, and if the other person is available, they open the door. If not, no harm done. But at least you tried. Psychologists often talk about micro-interactions, the tiny moments that shape our sense of safety. Research shows that brief acknowledgements, like apologies or polite signals, help people feel seen and respected. That safety lowers anxiety, which improves communication. In simple terms, when people feel safe, they listen better. And when they listen better, language flows more naturally. By observing these everyday apologies, I began practicing them myself. Very lightly. Very imperfectly. "Sorry, can I ask Sorry, I didn't catch that. Each time I said it, my heart beat a little faster. But each time, nothing bad happened. No one laughed. No one corrected me harshly. Conversations continued. Sometimes awkwardly. Sometimes smoothly. But they continued. This practice even followed me home. In small disagreements with my partner, I noticed my instinct to defend myself soften. Instead of preparing arguments, I tried something new. I said, "Sorry, I didn't realize that bothered you." The room felt different immediately. Not magically fixed, but safer. And safety is the foundation of every real conversation, in any language. Everyday America taught me that sorry is not an emotional confession. It's a social tool. A signal that says, I'm aware of you. And awareness builds trust faster than perfection ever will. Here's the unexpected punchline of this section. Americans don't apologize often because they feel guilty. They apologize often because they want life to move forward without unnecessary damage. And once I understood that, English stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like a shared space. My silence vs their sorry. Silence used to feel like my safest language. Long before I arrived in America, silence had protected me many times. When I didn't know the right English word, I stayed quiet. When I wasn't sure about pronunciation, I nodded instead of speaking. When conversations moved too fast, I smiled politely and disappeared inside my head. Silence felt clean. No mistakes. No embarrassment. No risk. At least, that's what I told myself. But during my second week in the US, I started to see silence differently. Not as safety, but as distance. One evening, I was invited to a small gathering. Nothing formal. Just people talking, laughing, sharing food. English floated around the room effortlessly. Not perfect English. Not academic English. Just real English. Jokes half finished. Sentences interrupted. Laughter in the middle of grammar mistakes. I sat there, listening carefully, translating silently, waiting for the right moment to speak. That moment never came. At one point, someone asked me a simple question. Very simple. My mind froze. I knew the words. I had practiced similar sentences many times. But my mouth hesitated. I felt the familiar heat in my face. That voice appeared again. What if you say it wrong? What if they don't understand? So I paused. Too long. The conversation gently moved on without me. No one was rude. No one excluded me. But I felt invisible. Later that night, something small happened. I accidentally interrupted someone while they were speaking. Immediately, before I could pull back, I heard myself say, "Oh, sorry." The word came out naturally. No planning. No fear. And the response surprised me. The other person smiled and said, "No worries, go ahead." Just like that. I was invited back into the conversation. That moment stayed with me. I realized something uncomfortable. My silence wasn't polite. It was self-protection. And while it protected me from mistakes, it also kept me disconnected. Americans, on the other hand, seem to use sorry as a bridge. They stepped forward imperfectly, softened the moment with an apology, and trusted the relationship to hold. In psychology, silence can signal many things: respect, fear, resistance, or withdrawal. But in fast-moving conversations, silence often gets interpreted as disinterest or distance. Even when it's not. I wasn't uninterested. I was scared. But fear doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes, it looks like quiet. That week, I started paying attention to how often Americans apologized before silence could grow. Sorry, I might be wrong, but, sorry, just adding one thing. These phrases weren't weakness. They were entry points. Emotional door handles. They allowed people to step into conversations without pushing. I tested this myself in small ways. At a store, I didn't understand a question. Instead of freezing, I said, "Sorry, could you say that again?" My heart raced. But the cashier repeated the sentence slowly, kindly. No irritation. At a bus stop, I asked for directions and added, "Sorry, I'm still learning." The other person slowed down. Immediately. Softer voice. Clearer words. Each time, the same pattern appeared. Apology first. Connection second. Relief third. What surprised me most was how this shifted my inner dialogue. When I allowed myself to say, "sorry" out loud, I stopped saying cruel things silently to myself. I stopped thinking, "You should know this already." I stopped replaying mistakes for hours. The apology wasn't just for others. It was permission for myself to be human. This realization spilled into my marriage, too. Back home, silence often followed arguments. We would retreat, waiting for the other person to make the first move. In America, surrounded by a culture of quick, light apologies, I tried something different. I said, "Sorry, I didn't explain myself well." Not a full surrender. Not self-blame. Just acknowledgement. The tension softened. We talked sooner. Repaired faster. Researchers call this emotional repair. Small signals that say, "I care about the relationship more than my pride." Studies show that couples who repair quickly, often through small apologies, experience less long-term resentment. Watching American couples apologize casually throughout the day helped me see how silence, when overused, can quietly damage connection. By the end of that week, I understood the real contrast. It wasn't Americans talking more and me talking less. It was Americans using sorry to stay present, while I used silence to disappear. Here's the punchline that changed everything for me. Silence feels safe, but it teaches your brain to avoid. Sorry feels risky, but it teaches your brain to recover. And recovery is where learning actually happens. When you stop hiding behind silence and allow yourself one small apology, you don't become weaker. You become visible. And once you're visible, language, real language, finally has somewhere to land. Week 2, a small apology. Week 2 didn't begin with confidence. It began with resistance. A quiet inner voice telling me, "You're still not ready." My English was improving in small ways, but emotionally, I was tired. Culture shock had settled in. Not loud anymore, just constant. And when you're tired, even small misunderstandings feel heavy. That's when the smallest apology of my life changed everything. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. No dramatic setting. No big argument. I was trying to explain something simple, very simple, to someone I had spoken with a few times before. A casual conversation. But my sentence came out wrong. Not grammatically wrong. Emotionally wrong. My tone sounded sharper than I intended. I saw it immediately in their face. A slight pause. A tiny shift in body language. Nothing exploded. But something closed. Old me would have gone quiet. Let the moment pass. Replay it later in my head. Blame myself silently. But something different happened this time. Almost without thinking, I said, "Sorry, that came out wrong." Then I stopped talking. No explanation. No defense. Just that. The silence that followed felt long. But it wasn't uncomfortable. The other person nodded and said, "It's okay. I get what you meant." And just like that, the door reopened. Conversation continued. Not perfectly. But honestly. I walked away from that moment feeling strange. Lighter. As if I had dropped something heavy I didn't realize I was carrying. That apology didn't cost me anything. But it gave me something valuable. Continuity. The relationship didn't break. The moment didn't harden. We moved forward. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. How many times in my life had I lost connection, not because of big mistakes, but because I didn't repair small moments. In many cultures, apologies are reserved for serious wrongdoing. In American culture, I was learning, apologies are often used for emotional maintenance. Like adjusting the temperature before the room gets too cold. From a psychological perspective, this makes sense. Studies on communication show that when tension appears, the brain quickly enters a defensive mode. A small apology interrupts that process. It tells the nervous system, "You're safe. This is not a threat." That's why even a short, "sorry," can prevent misunderstandings from growing into conflict. In week 2, I started noticing how often Americans used this kind of apology. "Sorry, I didn't mean it that way." "Sorry, bad timing." "Sorry." Just to clarify, these weren't dramatic confessions. They were quick emotional corrections. Like steering a car slightly back into the lane before drifting too far. I began practicing this in my English learning. When I misused a word, instead of freezing, I said, "Sorry, wrong word." When I misunderstood a question, I said, "Sorry, I thought you meant something else." Each time, communication improved. Not because my English suddenly became fluent, but because clarity replaced fear. This small habit followed me home, into my marriage. One evening, a misunderstanding surfaced. Nothing serious, but familiar. In the past, we might have both gone quiet, waiting for time to smooth things over. This time, I tried something new. I said, sorry, I was reacting, not listening. The room changed immediately. Not magically, but noticeably. The conversation softened. We talked sooner, laughed sooner, reconnected sooner. Research on relationships supports this. Couples who apologize early and lightly, without blame, recover faster from conflict. They don't let small issues harden into emotional distance. Watching American couples apologize casually throughout the day helped me see that strength isn't about standing firm. It's about staying flexible. In language learning, flexibility matters even more. When you believe every mistake defines you, your brain tightens. But when mistakes are followed by repair, your brain relaxes. Relaxation improves memory, listening ability, and speech flow. In other words, learning accelerates when fear decreases. By the end of week 2, I understood something important. My progress wasn't coming from new vocabulary lists or grammar rules. It was coming from a shift in mindset. I stopped trying to sound perfect. I started trying to stay connected. Here's the punchline that changed my second week completely. A small apology doesn't make you smaller, it keeps you moving. It doesn't erase your mistake, it prevents it from owning you. And once you learn how to apologize without shame, English stops being a performance and starts becoming a conversation. Love tested by language. By the middle of week 2, I realized something uncomfortable. English wasn't the hardest part of my life in America. Love was. Or more precisely, love filtered through a language that wasn't mine. When emotions are strong, even your mother tongue can fail you. In a second language, everything feels sharper, riskier, easier to misunderstand. And that's exactly where our relationship was being tested. Living in the US changed our rhythm. The pace of life was different. Expectations were different. Even silence felt different. Back home, we could argue, pause, and let time heal things. In America, everything moved faster. Conversations happened quickly. Decisions were immediate. And English was always present, quietly shaping how we expressed ourselves. One evening, a small disagreement surfaced. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those moments where two tired people interpret the same situation differently. I spoke first, trying to explain myself in English. My sentence was grammatically correct, but emotionally incomplete. The words carried logic, not care. I could feel it as soon as they left my mouth. The room cooled. She responded, also in English. Calm. Controlled. But distant. I recognized that distance. It was the kind that grows when both people feel unheard. In that moment, I wanted to defend myself. Explain more. Add reasons. Fix it with more words. But something I had learned over the past 2 weeks stopped me. Instead, I said, sorry. I'm not saying this well. That was it. No argument. No explanation. Just an admission of emotional limitation. And something shifted. Not instantly. But enough. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. The conversation slowed down. English became simpler. Softer. We weren't trying to win anymore. We were trying to understand. This was new for me. In my old mindset, apologizing meant losing ground. In American culture, I was learning, apologizing often means creating space. Space for emotions. Space for clarity. Space for love to breathe again. Research on bilingual relationships shows that conflicts in a second language often feel more intense. Emotional nuance is harder to express. Misinterpretations happen faster. That's why small repairs, like simple apologies, are crucial. They signal intention even when words fail. As the days passed, I started observing American couples more closely. Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly noticing patterns. They apologized quickly. Casually. Sometimes almost playfully. Sorry, I'm grumpy. Sorry, long day. These apologies didn't weaken their position. They protected the relationship from unnecessary damage. I brought this habit home. When frustration appeared, I tried saying sorry early. Not as surrender, but as connection. Sorry, I'm tired and reacting. Sorry, I need a minute. Each time, the tension dropped faster than before. English still wasn't perfect. But the message landed. One night, we talked about it openly. About how language had changed us. How English sometimes made us sound colder than we felt. How easy it was to misjudge tone. That conversation itself felt like progress. We weren't just learning English separately, we were learning how to love through English. From a psychological standpoint, this makes sense. Apologies activate empathy. They reduce defensiveness. They remind both sides that the relationship is the priority. In cross-cultural relationships, where misunderstandings multiply, this skill becomes essential. By the end of week 2, I no longer saw apologies as weakness. I saw them as emotional translation. When English failed to carry my feelings accurately, sorry carried my intention. It filled the gap between what I meant and what was heard. Here's the punchline that stayed with me. Love doesn't need perfect English, it needs honest repair. And sometimes, the strongest sentence in any language is not a long explanation, but a quiet apology that says, I care more about us than being right. Week 3, saying sorry first. Week 3 was the hardest so far. Not because of English tests, paperwork, or culture shock, but because something inside me resisted change. By then, I understood how Americans used apologies. I had seen how sorry softened conversations, repaired relationships, and reduced tension. I knew it worked. And yet, when it mattered most, I still hesitated. Knowing something and living it are very different things. That week, pressure quietly built up. Small responsibilities. Unspoken expectations. The kind of stress that doesn't explode, but slowly tightens. I felt it in my body before I noticed it in my thoughts. Shorter patience. Faster reactions. Less listening. English, when I was tired, felt sharper. Less forgiving. And that's when the real test arrived. It started with something minor. A misunderstanding about timing. A plan that didn't go as expected. No raised voices. No dramatic words. Just that subtle emotional shift, the moment when two people feel slightly out of sync. In the past, I would have waited. Let the silence stretch. Let time cool things down. Silence was my old strategy. But by week 3, I knew what silence did. It didn't heal. It delayed. I felt the familiar urge to explain myself first. To justify. To prove that I wasn't wrong. That my intention mattered. But another thought interrupted. What if I say sorry first? Not because I was wrong. But because I cared. That idea scared me more than speaking broken English. My heart raced. My chest felt tight. And then, quietly, I said, sorry. I should have said that differently. The sentence was simple. Incomplete. Almost awkward. But it landed. The reaction wasn't dramatic. No tears. No speeches. Just a pause. Then a softer response. The conversation shifted direction. Not toward blame, but toward understanding. The emotional temperature dropped. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. Saying sorry first doesn't mean you lose. It means you lead. Psychologists call this initiating repair. The person who offers the first apology often sets the tone for resolution. It signals emotional maturity and confidence. You're not apologizing because you're weak. You're apologizing because you're secure enough to prioritize connection. That week, I practiced this outside of my relationship too. In conversations with strangers. In small misunderstandings. When I interrupted someone, I said sorry immediately. When I misunderstood a question, I apologized before explaining. Each time, the response was the same: openness, cooperation, calm. English felt different when I stopped protecting my ego. My sentences didn't get longer. But they became clearer. I listened better. I reacted slower. Apology created space, for thinking, for feeling, for choosing better words. This habit also changed how I saw Americans. I used to think they apologized because they were overly polite. By week 3, I saw it differently. They apologized because they valued momentum. Emotional momentum. Life doesn't stop for perfect communication. It moves forward with small repairs along the way. In marriage, this lesson hit deeply. Waiting to be understood often keeps both people stuck. Saying sorry first unlocks movement. It doesn't erase your perspective, it makes room for it to be heard later. Neuroscience supports this. When conflict arises, the brain's threat system activates. Apologies deactivate that system. They reduce cortisol levels and increase openness. That's why conversations feel safer after a sincere sorry. Safety allows learning. Learning allows growth. By the end of week 3, I noticed something unexpected. I felt stronger. Not because I argued better, but because I recovered faster. Mistakes didn't linger. Tension didn't harden. English stopped being a battlefield and became a bridge. Here's the punchline that defined week 3 for me. the strongest person in the room is often the one who says sorry first, not because they are wrong, but because they are brave enough to protect what matters. Why sorry feels strong here. By week 3, I stopped asking whether Americans apologized often. That part was obvious. The real question had changed into something deeper. Why does saying sorry feel strong here, not weak? I wasn't looking for a cultural slogan. I wanted an explanation that made sense in my body, not just in my head. And slowly, through observation and experience, the answer began to form. In American culture, independence is valued deeply. Personal space matters. Time matters. Choice matters. When you interrupt someone, inconvenience them, or even slightly cross an invisible boundary, it registers immediately. Saying sorry is not an admission of failure. It's a recognition of impact. You're saying, I see how this affects you. And that awareness is power. I noticed that apologies in America are usually short. Clean. No drama. No emotional performance. People don't bow. They don't over-explain. They don't beg for forgiveness. They acknowledge and move on. This matters because the brain processes brief apologies differently than long ones. Research in social psychology shows that short, sincere apologies reduce defensiveness more effectively than lengthy explanations. Too many words often sound like excuses. This explained why my early apologies felt so hard. Back home, apologies were heavy. They came with guilt, shame, or loss of status. In the US, apologies were light, but intentional. They weren't about self-judgment. They were about regulation. Emotional regulation. When someone says sorry early, it prevents escalation. It tells the nervous system, relax. This is not a threat. That's why Americans can disagree strongly without destroying relationships. They repair quickly. They don't wait for damage to accumulate. As a language learner, this changed everything for me. I had been treating English like a test. Every mistake felt permanent. But American communication treats mistakes as temporary. You acknowledge, adjust, and continue. That mindset makes learning sustainable. Neuroscience supports this. When people feel safe, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for learning and decision-making, functions better. Fear shuts it down. Apologies reduce fear. That's why classrooms, workplaces, and families that normalize quick apologies tend to be more productive and emotionally healthy. I tested this idea consciously. In conversations, I focused less on sounding correct and more on maintaining emotional flow. When I sensed confusion, I said, sorry, let me rephrase. When I felt tension, I said, sorry, I didn't mean it that way. Each time, communication reset. My English didn't need to be perfect. My intention was clear. This perspective also changed how I viewed strength. Strength, in American culture, isn't about being unshakable. It's about being adaptable. The ability to recover quickly is valued more than the ability to never fail. Saying sorry is part of that recovery skill set. In my marriage, this realization was transformative. Instead of defending positions, we started protecting connection. Apologies became tools, not confessions. We weren't keeping score. We were maintaining alignment. Here's the science-backed truth I wish I had learned earlier. The brain remembers how it felt more than what was said. Apologies change how moments feel. And feelings shape memory. That's why one small sorry can outweigh 10 perfect sentences. By the end of this section, the answer was clear to me. Saying sorry feels strong in America because it preserves forward motion. It keeps conversations alive. Relationships intact. Learning active. Here's the punchline that finally settled in my body. Weakness is needing to be right all the time. Strength is being able to say sorry and keep moving. Learning English through emotion. By week 4, something unexpected happened. My English didn't suddenly become fluent, but it started to feel alive. Not like a school subject. Not like a skill I had to prove. It felt woven into my emotions, my reactions, my relationships. I realized I wasn't really learning English through textbooks or apps anymore. I was learning it through feeling. For a long time, I believed English learning was a technical problem. More vocabulary, better grammar, clearer pronunciation. If I fixed those, confidence would follow. But in America, I saw the opposite. Confidence often came first, carried by emotion, and language followed later. People spoke even when sentences were messy. They repaired mistakes quickly and moved on. Emotion led. Language adjusted. I began to notice how my emotions affected my English in real time. When I felt calm, my listening improved. When I felt safe, my words came out more naturally. When I felt judged, or imagined judgment, my mind went blank. This wasn't about intelligence. It was about the nervous system. Neuroscience explains this clearly. When we feel anxious, the brain shifts into protection mode. Blood flow moves away from areas responsible for language processing. That's why your English disappears under pressure. But when you feel emotionally safe, the brain opens up. Memory, listening, and speaking work better. Emotion isn't separate from language. It's the gateway. In America, I saw how apologies helped regulate emotion instantly. A simple sorry lowered tension. That drop in tension created space for understanding. And in that space, English flowed more easily. I started using this intentionally in my practice. When I listened to conversations and missed parts, instead of panicking, I said, "Sorry, I didn't catch that." When I spoke and felt unsure, I added, "Sorry, I'm still learning." These weren't excuses. They were emotional resets. And every reset made learning smoother. This approach also changed how I practiced alone. Instead of forcing myself through long study sessions, I paid attention to how I felt. If frustration rose, I paused. If curiosity appeared, I followed it. Learning became gentler, and strangely, more effective. I thought about my past experiences. How many times did I quit because English felt heavy? How often did I confuse emotional exhaustion with lack of ability? In America, I learned that sustainable learning depends on emotional management more than discipline. This lesson became especially clear in my marriage. English wasn't just a communication tool. It was the medium through which emotions traveled. When we spoke English, under stress, misunderstandings multiplied. When we softened the emotional tone, often with a small apology, language became clearer. Not because words improved, but because listening improved. Psychologists call this emotional alignment. When people feel emotionally aligned, they interpret language more generously. They fill in gaps kindly instead of critically. That generosity is crucial for language learners. Without it, every mistake feels like rejection. By week 4, I stopped asking myself, did I say that perfectly? I started asking, did I stay connected? That question changed everything. My English became simpler, but more human. Short sentences, honest pauses, clear intentions. This method doesn't show up in traditional language courses, but it shows up in real life. Real English is emotional before it's grammatical. And Americans, perhaps without realizing it, teach this through their constant, gentle use of sorry. Here's the punchline that reshaped how I learn languages forever. You don't master English by controlling words. You master it by regulating emotion. And when emotion is calm, language follows naturally. Week 4, Family and Peace. Week 4 felt different from the start. Not lighter, not easier, but calmer. The kind of calm that doesn't come from everything going right, but from knowing how to respond when things go wrong. By then, apologies were no longer something I practiced consciously. They had become part of how I moved through family life in America. Family life here had its own rhythm. Days were structured. Time mattered. Everyone had responsibilities, schedules, expectations. Small misunderstandings happened often, not because of conflict, but because life was full. And for the first time, I noticed how quickly American families repaired these small moments. A missed message. A forgotten task. A tired reaction. Instead of tension building, someone would say, sorry, I forgot, or sorry, long day. And that was enough. No lectures. No silence. No emotional debt carried into the next day. That simplicity struck me deeply. In my own family, especially in the past, misunderstandings often lingered. Not because they were big, but because no one wanted to speak first. Silence felt like dignity. But silence also stretched discomfort. In America, I saw something else, dignity in repair. One evening, a small misunderstanding happened at home. Nothing dramatic. A plan that didn't go as expected. Everyone was a little tired. The old pattern tried to surface. Tension in the air. Short replies. That familiar emotional tightening. And then, almost automatically, I said, sorry, I should have been clearer. The room changed. Not instantly happy, but softer. Voices slowed. Explanations followed without sharp edges. The misunderstanding dissolved before it could harden into resentment. That moment stayed with me, because it felt like proof. Proof that peace isn't something you wait for, it's something you build in small pieces. Psychologists often talk about family systems and Emotional regulation. Families that repair quickly, using short apologies and clear acknowledgement, experience lower long-term stress. Children in these families learn something powerful. Mistakes are safe. Repair is normal. Connection is reliable. That realization hit me hard when I thought about language learning. If English mistakes feel unsafe, the brain avoids speaking. But if mistakes are followed by gentle repair, the brain stays open. Families that normalize apology are unknowingly creating the best environment for learning, not just language, but life skills. I began to notice how children here responded to apologies. When adults said sorry to them, kids didn't become disrespectful, as some people fear. They became calmer, more cooperative, more secure. Apology wasn't authority loss. It was trust building. That changed how I saw strength again. Strength wasn't about never failing your family. It was about modeling how to recover when you do. Language played a quiet, but important role in this. Saying sorry in English felt lighter than in my native language. Less loaded. Less dramatic. It didn't reopen old wounds. It closed small ones before they deepened. English, in this sense, became a tool for emotional hygiene. By week 4, English had woven itself into daily family interactions. Not as perfect sentences, but as functional language. Useful language. Language that served connection, not ego. This also reflected back on my learning motivation. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was studying English. I was living it. Using it to maintain peace. To clarify. To reconnect. That made practice effortless. Natural. Neuroscience explains this beautifully. The brain learns best when learning is tied to meaning and emotion. When language helps you solve real emotional problems, like repairing family tension, it becomes memorable. Sticky. Alive. I realized then why so many learners struggle. They practice English in isolation, detached from real emotion. No wonder motivation fades. But when English becomes the language of peace, repair, and understanding, quitting feels unnatural. Here's the punchline that defined week 4 for me. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of repair. And in America, one small word often does that repair better than 1,000 explanations. Sorry. Sorry changed my mindset. By the time week 4 was coming to an end, I noticed a quiet shift inside me. Nothing dramatic. No sudden confidence boost. Just a different way of standing in the world. The word sorry had stopped feeling like a reaction and started feeling like a mindset. A way of thinking. A way of approaching people, language, and even myself. Before coming to America, I believed mindset change required motivation, discipline, or strong willpower. But what actually changed me was much smaller. Repeated moments of repair. Tiny apologies that prevented emotional damage from accumulating. Over time, those moments rewired how I responded to difficulty. I began to see mistakes differently. Not as personal failures, but as information. Feedback. When something went wrong, my first question was no longer, how do I defend myself? It became, How do I reconnect? That shift changed how English felt in my body. My shoulders relaxed. My breath slowed. My mind stayed clearer. In learning English, this mindset was revolutionary. Instead of avoiding situations where I might sound imperfect, I stepped into them lightly. If I made a mistake, I repaired it. If I misunderstood, I clarified. Each interaction became a loop: attempt, repair, continue. No shame. No freezing. Psychologists call this a growth-oriented response. People who view errors as temporary and repairable learn faster and retain information longer. Apologies play a key role in this process because they allow the brain to exit threat mode quickly. Without that exit, learning stalls. I also noticed how this mindset affected my listening. When I wasn't busy defending myself internally, I could actually hear people. Tone. Emotion. Intention. English sounded richer. Less like noise. More like connection. This mindset extended into my marriage as well. Conversations felt safer. Not because we never disagreed, but because disagreement no longer felt dangerous. Apologies created emotional elasticity. We could stretch without tearing. One evening, we reflected on this change together. We realized that saying sorry didn't mean erasing our boundaries. It meant protecting our bond. That distinction mattered. Apology wasn't submission. It was collaboration. In American culture, this collaborative mindset shows up everywhere. At work. In schools. In families. People don't wait for perfect conditions to apologize. They apologize to create better conditions. That proactive approach to repair builds trust over time. Neuroscience supports this again. Trust reduces cognitive load. When you trust that relationships can recover, your brain frees up resources for creativity and learning. That's why environments with psychological safety outperform those driven by fear or blame. By the end of week 4, English felt less like a foreign system and more like a shared space. A place where imperfection was expected and repair was normal. That realization removed a huge mental burden I had carried for years. Here's the punchline that reshaped my mindset completely. Confidence isn't the absence of mistakes, it's the confidence that mistakes won't destroy connection. And once you believe that, English stops being something you fear and starts becoming something you use. Strength, sorry, and the road ahead. The final days of the 4th week arrived quietly. No big moment. No final test. Just ordinary mornings, familiar routines, and a feeling I hadn't expected when this journey began: stability. Not certainty. Not perfection. But a steady sense that I was no longer fighting my environment, my language, or myself. I started to reflect on the question that framed this entire journey. Why do Americans apologize so often? At first, it had sounded almost humorous. Even excessive. But now, after 4 weeks of living inside that culture, the answer felt clear and deeply personal. Americans don't apologize because they are weak. They apologize because they value forward movement. Saying sorry is not about the past, it's about clearing the path ahead. That realization reframed everything for me. My struggles with English. My struggles in marriage. My struggles with identity in a new country. All of them had been made heavier by resistance. By the need to be right. By the fear of losing face. Apology removed that resistance. I noticed how often the word sorry appeared at turning points. When tension could grow or dissolve. When misunderstanding could deepen or soften. When silence could linger or be replaced by clarity. That one word acted like a hinge. Small, simple, but powerful. In English, sorry is short. Gentle. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't carry dramatic weight. That matters. Because when language is light, it becomes usable. And when it's usable, it becomes transformational. This is why I believe learning English through real-life stories, especially emotional ones, is so effective. Language sticks when it helps you survive emotionally, not just grammatically. When English helped me restore peace, it became meaningful. And meaning fuels memory. I began to understand something deeper about strength. Strength isn't about holding your ground at all costs. It's about knowing when standing firm matters, and when letting go matters more. Apology is not giving up your values. It's choosing connection over control. In marriage, this lesson was invaluable. We didn't become stronger because we argued less. We became stronger because we repaired faster. Apologies shortened the distance between hurt and healing. They prevented small cracks from becoming permanent damage. In America, this repair culture felt normalized, expected, healthy. Children saw adults apologize and learned that accountability and love can coexist. That mistakes don't equal rejection. That safety lives in honesty. For me, as a language learner, that environment was freeing. English stopped being a performance. It became participation. I didn't need perfect sentences. I needed real intention. And when intention was clear, language followed. Looking back, the 4-week journey wasn't about mastering English. It was about mastering response. Learning how to respond to discomfort, misunderstanding, and emotional friction. English was simply the medium. That's why this story matters. Not because it teaches vocabulary, but because it teaches courage. The courage to speak imperfectly. To apologize sincerely. To believe that connection can survive mistakes. Here is the final punchline, the one that ties everything together. Saying sorry doesn't make you smaller. It makes the space between people bigger. Big enough for growth. Big enough for learning. Big enough for love. As this chapter ends, the journey doesn't. English will continue to challenge me. Life in America will continue to surprise me. Marriage will continue to test me. But now, I carry a tool that works everywhere. A simple word. A powerful mindset. If you are learning English, struggling with communication, or navigating relationships across cultures, remember this. Fluency begins with safety. And safety often begins with one honest word. Sorry. If this story resonated with you, stay with this channel. More real stories. More slow English. More lessons that come from life, not textbooks. Because the strongest language is the one that helps us stay connected. And sometimes, that language starts with an apology. If you've stayed until this moment, it means the story touched something inside you. Not because my English was perfect. Not because life in America is easy. But because you recognized yourself in the silence, the mistakes, and the quiet courage of saying sorry when it matters most. This story was never really about Americans. It was about you. About learning English when you feel tired. About holding a marriage together when words fail. About standing in a new culture, and wondering if you're strong enough. Now you know the truth. Strength is not speaking loudly. Strength is choosing connection over ego. And sometimes, strength sounds like one simple word, sorry. If you are learning English, don't chase perfection. Chase meaning. Listen slowly. Speak gently. And let real stories teach you the language that textbooks never will. This channel exists for people like you, who want to learn real English through real life. Who believe that language can heal, not just impress. And who are ready to grow, even when it feels uncomfortable. If this video helped you feel understood, like this video to support the channel. Subscribe for more slow, clear, emotional English stories set in real American life. And share this video with someone who is learning English, or learning how to be brave again. More true stories are coming. More love. More challenges. More growth. And more English you can actually feel, not just memorize. This is not the end. It's just the beginning of your real English journey.